The gas lamps flickered against the fog-choked streets of London as a young woman's fingers worked frantically in the dim light of a Whitechapel sweatshop, her needle-piercing silk that would never touch her own skin. It was 2:30 in the morning on a January night in 1851, and Mary Sullivan had been sewing for 16 hours straight. The fine emerald gown taking shape beneath her bloodied fingertips would be worn once, perhaps twice, by a lady whose name she would never know, at a ball she could never attend, in a world that existed mere miles yet immeasurable distances from the cramped, airless room where Mary and 40 other seamstresses bent over their work like penitents at prayer. Outside, the great exhibition was being prepared, that grand celebration of British achievement and industrial might. But here in the darkness, the true cost of Victorian splendour was being paid in eyesight, in youth, in the very lives of those who stitched its glory together, thread by thread. This is the story of the Victorian wardrobe, but not as you might imagine it. Not merely the crinolines and top hats, the corsets and calling cards that populate our costume dramas and heritage films. This is the story of what those clothes meant, what they demanded, and what they destroyed. It is a story that begins not in the 1800s, but centuries earlier, because to understand the Victorian obsession with dress, we must first understand the long shadow that royal fashion cast across the lives of ordinary people. Before we journey deeper into this world of silk and suffering, I want to invite you to join our community. If you're finding value in these historical explorations, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue researching and sharing these untold stories, the human experiences that textbooks often overlook. Now, let's step back through the centuries to where our story truly begins. The year is 1558, and Elizabeth Tudor has just ascended to the throne of England. She is 25 years old, unmarried, and ruling a nation torn by religious strife and threatened by foreign powers. Her legitimacy is questioned, her gender considered a fatal weakness, her treasury nearly empty. She has one weapon that will prove more powerful than any army: her wardrobe. Elizabeth I understood something that would echo through British history for the next 3 centuries. Clothes were not mere covering for the body. They were power made visible, authority woven into fabric, majesty that could be seen and touched and remembered. By the time of her death in 1603, Elizabeth would own over 2,000 gowns, each one a calculated statement of her divine right to rule, her untouchable status, her transformation from mortal woman into Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, half monarch and half myth. These were not garments as we understand them today. Elizabeth's gowns were architectural achievements, structures of wire and whalebone, silk and silver thread, pearls and precious stones. A single dress might weigh 60 pounds. It might contain enough gold thread to ransom a gentleman. It might display rubies the size of a man's thumb, emeralds that caught and held the light like captured stars. To see the Queen was to witness something almost supernatural, a being who glittered and gleamed, whose very presence asserted the vast distance between royalty and commoner, between the chosen of God and ordinary mortals. The ruff alone, that great cartwheel of starched linen that framed her face, required hours of preparation, special heating irons, and the skills of highly trained servants. It was deliberately uncomfortable, practically immobile, utterly impractical. That was precisely the point. Only someone who need never perform physical labor, who existed solely to be seen and admired, could wear such garments. But Elizabeth's wardrobe was more than personal display. It was economic engine and political statement. The Queen's preference for English-made silk helped establish a domestic industry. Her adoption of certain styles could make or break the fortunes of merchants and craftsmen. When she wore black and white, the court wore black and white. When she favoured a particular style of sleeve or a certain cut of bodice, every noblewoman in England scrambled to imitate her, and every tailor and seamstress found their workshops flooded with demands for the same. Fashion had become a form of patriotism, a way of demonstrating one's loyalty to the crown. To fail to keep up with royal style was to risk appearing disloyal, provincial, insufficiently devoted to the Queen and country. The cost of this devotion was staggering. A gentleman's suit suitable for court might cost the equivalent of several years' wages for a skilled worker. A lady's wardrobe for a single season at court could bankrupt a moderately wealthy family. Sumptuary laws attempted to control the excess, decreeing what fabrics and colours could be worn by which ranks of society, but these laws were largely ineffective. The Tudor and Stuart courts became competitions of display, where nobles literally wore their wealth on their bodies, where financial ruin was risked in the name of appearing sufficiently magnificent. Men mortgaged their estates to afford the proper velvet and lace. Women pawned their jewels to buy new jewels to sew onto gowns. The pressure was relentless, exhausting, and absolutely necessary for anyone who hoped to advance at court or maintain their social position. This was the world that the Stuart monarchs inherited and intensified. James I, despite his often slovenly personal appearance, maintained the expectation of courtly magnificence. His son, Charles I, was painted by Van Dyck in such splendour that his eventual execution seemed almost impossible to imagine. How could a man who looked like a god, whose very bearing spoke of divine appointment, be brought to the scaffold like a common criminal? Yet he was, in 1649, and for 11 years England experimented with life without a monarch. The Puritan Commonwealth that followed attempted to strip away the gorgeous excesses of royal fashion, to dress society in sober blacks and browns, to make modesty and plainness the new virtues. It was an experiment that many found stifling, joyless, a denial of beauty itself. When Charles II returned to the throne in 1660, he brought with him fashions learned during his exile in France, and the English court exploded once again into colour and extravagance. The Restoration was not just political, but aesthetic, a deliberate return to the gorgeous excesses that the Puritans had tried to suppress. Men wore enormous wigs that cascaded down their backs, their coats heavy with embroidery, their stockings silk, their shoes adorned with ribbons and rosettes. Women's necklines plunged, their waists were cinched, their skirts expanded. The message was clear. Pleasure had returned to England, and it would be worn on the body for all to see. It was during the late 17th century that the infrastructure of fashion truly began to take shape. Mantua makers, the dressmakers who specialized in women's gowns, formed their own guilds and workshops. Tailors who had once made clothes for both men and women began to specialize solely in menswear, considering it a higher art, a more serious profession. The mantua makers were almost exclusively women, and though their skills were considerable, their social status remained lower than that of the male tailors. This division would persist for centuries, and it meant that the women who made women's clothes were generally paid less, respected less, and worked in worse conditions than their male counterparts. The actual making of these garments was a process that could take months. A formal court gown might require 50 yards of silk, all of which had to be carefully measured, cut, and stitched by hand. Every seam was sewn with thread that had been waxed and strengthened. Every buttonhole was carefully worked. The embroidery alone could take weeks, as silk threads in dozens of colours were used to create elaborate patterns of flowers, vines, animals, and abstract designs. Gold and silver thread, known as passing, was couched onto the surface of the fabric, creating raised designs that caught the light. Pearls and precious stones were sewn on individually, each one secured with multiple stitches to ensure it wouldn't be lost. The women who did this work inhabited a strange liminal space in society. They were skilled craftswomen whose labour created objects of immense value and beauty, yet they themselves were often poor, their lives precarious, their futures uncertain. A successful mantua maker might own her own shop and employ several assistants, achieving a measure of financial independence rare for women of her era. But the majority of women who sewed for the fashion trade worked as employees or piece workers, paid by the garment or by the hour, their income dependent on the whims of fashion and the demands of wealthy clients who might delay payment for months or even years. By the time we reach the reign of Queen Anne in the early 1700s, English fashion had developed its own distinct character, influenced by French styles but determinedly British in its interpretation. The mantua, that formal gown that gave its name to the women who made it, had become the standard court dress. It was a complex garment consisting of a bodice, a petticoat or underskirt, and an overskirt that was arranged in elaborate folds and pleats. The whole ensemble might be made from matching fabric, or it might combine different textiles to create contrast and visual interest. Brocades, damasks, and embroidered silks were the most prestigious materials, their patterns specifically designed to display well on the large surfaces of skirts and stomachers. Stomacher, that triangular piece that covered the front of the bodice, was often the most heavily decorated part of the entire ensemble. It might be completely covered in embroidery, or it might be adorned with ribbons arranged in a ladder pattern called échelle. The amount of work that went into a single stomacher could be astonishing. Hundreds of hours of embroidery creating designs of such intricacy that they resembled paintings in thread. And these were items that might be worn only once or twice, then discarded or cut apart to salvage the valuable trimmings. The 18th century was a period of relative stability in England, at least for the upper classes. The country was growing wealthy on trade and the exploitation of its colonies. The aristocracy built magnificent country houses filled with treasures from around the world. London expanded and developed into a true capital city, with shops and theatres, pleasure gardens, and coffee houses. Fashion became not just a court matter, but an urban phenomenon, something discussed and debated, illustrated in prints and described in letters. The middle classes, those merchants and professionals who were accumulating wealth without aristocratic titles, began to aspire to fashionable dress, and the fashion industry began to expand to meet their needs. But even as the customer base broadened, the conditions for those who actually made the clothes remained harsh. Apprenticeships in the needle trades typically lasted 7 years, during which a young girl would work for room, board, and minimal pay, learning the skills of her trade while her labour enriched her mistress. The hours were long, the rooms poorly lit and often poorly heated. Eyesight was a precious commodity in this world, and many seamstresses found their vision failing by their 20s, their ability to do the fine work that commanded the highest prices declining just as they reached their physical prime. The French Revolution in 1789 sent shockwaves through European fashion as through everything else. The elaborate gowns and towering wigs of the Ancien Regime suddenly seemed not just old-fashioned but dangerous, symbols of the aristocratic excess that had led to the guillotine. Fashion simplified dramatically, at least temporarily, as neoclassical styles inspired by ancient Greece and Rome came into vogue. Women wore high-waisted, relatively unstructured gowns made of light cotton or muslin. Men abandoned their embroidered coats for simpler styles that anticipated modern business dress. It was a remarkable moment of democratization in fashion, when for a brief period the gap between how the wealthy dressed and how the moderately prosperous dressed narrowed considerably. But this simplification didn't last. By the time Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, opulence was returning to fashion, though in new forms. The Regency period in England, lasting roughly from 1811 to 1820, saw fashions that were elegant and refined, with an emphasis on quality of materials and cut rather than heavy ornamentation. This was the world Jane Austen described, where a woman's wardrobe might be relatively limited but chosen with care, where a man's coat was judged by the excellence of its tailoring rather than the richness of its embroidery. Then, in 1837, an 18-year-old girl inherited the throne of the United Kingdom, and everything changed. Victoria was young, sheltered, and keenly aware of the dignity her position required. She was also deeply moral, influenced by her husband Albert's German earnestness and high-minded principles. Together, they would reshape not just British fashion, but British society, establishing codes of behaviour and dress that would define the era that bears her name. The Victorian age began with fashion still relatively restrained. Skirts were full, but not enormous. Sleeves were fitted. Colours were often soft pastels or delicate prints. But as Victoria's reign progressed, fashion became increasingly elaborate, restrictive, and expensive. The crinoline, a cage-like structure made of steel hoops, was introduced in the 1850s and grew to enormous proportions by the 1860s. Women's skirts could extend 6 feet in diameter, making it difficult to move through doorways, impossible to sit in ordinary chairs, and genuinely dangerous around open fires. Yet women of fashion adopted the style with enthusiasm, despite its impracticality and hazards. Why? Because fashion has never been primarily about practicality. It is about signaling, about displaying one's place in the social hierarchy, about demonstrating that one has the leisure and resources to follow trends regardless of their utility. A woman in a massive crinoline was declaring that she did not need to work, that she had servants to help her dress and navigate her daily life, that her body was an object of display rather than a tool for labour. The crinoline was class warfare conducted through clothing. For the women who made these garments, the introduction of the crinoline meant an explosion of work. More fabric meant more cutting and sewing. More elaborate styles meant more detailed work. The sewing machine, invented in the 1840s and commercially successful by the 1850s, did speed some aspects of production, but it also increased expectations. Now that seams could be sewn more quickly by machine, there was pressure to complete garments faster, to take on more orders, to work longer hours. The sewing machine was celebrated as a labour-saving device, but for many seamstresses, it simply meant that they were expected to produce more work in the same amount of time. The 1850s also saw the rise of the department store, those great palaces of consumption where the middle classes could come to shop for ready-made clothing and accessories. Stores like Harrods, Selfridges and Liberty's in London became destinations, places where shopping itself became a form of entertainment. But behind the elegant showrooms and attentive shop assistants was a vast machinery of production. Workrooms full of women bent over their sewing, cutting rooms where men laid out pattern pieces, warehouses where finished goods were stored awaiting sale. The conditions in these workrooms were often as bad as or worse than those in independent dressmaking establishments, because the pressure to produce goods quickly and cheaply was relentless. The piecework system, where workers were paid by the number of items they completed rather than by the hour, meant that the only way to earn a decent wage was to work at a punishing pace for as many hours as one could stay awake. Women would start work at dawn and continue past midnight, their fingers moving automatically even as their minds dulled with exhaustion. The fine work required for fashionable clothing demanded good light, but candles and gas lamps were expensive. So many workshops were dim, forcing the workers to strain their eyes to see their stitches. The combination of poor light, endless close work, and inadequate rest meant that many seamstresses developed serious eye problems, chronic headaches, and a general physical breakdown that was simply accepted as the price of the trade. The journalist Henry Mayhew, in his groundbreaking work London Labour and the London Poor, published in the 1840s and 1850s, documented the lives of working-class Londoners with unprecedented detail and sympathy. His interviews with seamstresses revealed women who worked 90-hour weeks during the busy season, who were paid so little that they could barely afford bread, who lived in freezing garrets and pawned their possessions to survive between jobs. He told of women who sewed shirts for 4p apiece, shirts that would be sold for many shillings, who needed to complete 24 shirts a week just to pay their rent and buy the cheapest food. The mathematics of poverty were brutal and unforgiving. Some of these women, desperate and unable to survive on their sewing wages alone, turned to prostitution to supplement their income. This wasn't uncommon, and it gave rise to a stereotypical figure that haunted Victorian social consciousness: the fallen needlewoman, the seamstress turned prostitute, an object of pity and moral concern. Reformers wrote about these women, middle-class ladies formed charitable organisations to help them, and yet the fundamental economic structures that made their situation so desperate remained largely unchanged. It was easier to provide occasional charity than to demand that the fashion industry pay living wages. By the 1860s and 1870s, the Victorian fashion system had reached an almost absurd level of complexity and elaboration. The crinoline began to collapse, its fullness moving to the back of the skirt in the form of the bustle, a framework that projected the skirts out behind in a shape that defied natural anatomy. Bodices were fitted with extreme tightness, requiring corsets that compressed the internal organs and restricted breathing. Sleeves were tight, collars were high, every inch of the body was covered and controlled. The ideal Victorian woman in fashionable dress could hardly move, could barely breathe, was essentially an ornamental object rather than a functional human being. The construction of these garments involved techniques and understructures that were marvels of engineering. A fashionable 1870s dress might require a chemise, drawers, a corset cover, one or more petticoats, a bustle framework, a foundation skirt, an overdress, and a separate bodice or jacket. Each of these items had to fit perfectly, and many of them had to be made specifically for the individual wearer. The corset in particular was an item that required expert fitting. Made of cotton or silk fabric, stiffened with whalebone or steel, closed with lacing and reinforced with rows of stitching, a corset was a complex garment that could take several fittings to get right. The corset has become perhaps the most controversial garment of the Victorian era. Modern accounts often emphasize its restrictive nature, the way it compressed women's bodies into the fashionable silhouette, the health problems it could cause. These concerns aren't unfounded. Tight lacing, the practice of lacing one's corset as tightly as possible to achieve the smallest possible waist, did cause health problems including damaged ribs, displaced organs, and breathing difficulties. However, it's important to understand that not all Victorian women tight-laced, and for many women, the corset was simply a foundation garment that provided support and shaped their clothing, much as a bra might today. What's undeniable is that the Victorian corset was a garment that took time and often assistance to put on and take off, that restricted one's movements and required one to move in particular ways, and that was seen as essential to respectability. A woman without a corset was improperly dressed, almost scandalously so. The corset was thus both a practical garment and a tool of social control, ensuring that women's bodies were shaped in acceptable ways, that their movements were appropriately restricted, that they presented themselves according to social expectations. The making of corsets was a specialized trade, with its own makers and fitters. A well-made corset was expensive, and many working-class women made do with cheap, poorly constructed versions that provided the appearance of proper dress without the quality of fit. This meant that working women often wore garments that were even more uncomfortable than those worn by the wealthy, because poor construction meant pressure in the wrong places, stays that poked through the fabric, lacing that wouldn't hold. As Victoria's reign progressed, reform movements began to challenge the extremes of fashion. The aesthetic movement of the 1870s and 1880s promoted softer, more flowing styles inspired by medieval and Renaissance art. The Rational Dress Society, founded in 1881, campaigned against corsets and impractical garments, advocating for clothing that allowed freedom of movement and didn't damage women's health. These movements had limited immediate impact on mainstream fashion, but they represented a growing awareness that fashion was not simply a neutral expression of beauty, but a system with real consequences for women's lives and bodies. The 1880s saw fashion reach perhaps its most extreme elaboration. Skirts were draped in fantastically complex ways, with multiple layers of fabric caught up in swags and pleats and folds. Trimmings were layered on with abandon: ribbons, lace, embroidery, beading, fringe, artificial flowers. A single dress might combine several different fabrics in various colors, each cut and applied in a different way. The effect could be magnificent, but it was also overwhelming, and the labor required to create such garments was staggering. This was also the era when department stores began to employ thousands of workers, when ready-made clothing became increasingly common, when fashion began its transformation into the industry we know today. But the working conditions that reformers had been decrying for decades continued largely unchanged. The sweating system, as it was called, where subcontractors took work from larger companies and distributed it to workers who laboured in their own homes or in small workshops for minimal pay, became more entrenched rather than less. In 1888, a series of articles in a London newspaper exposed conditions in the East End sweatshops where cheap clothing was produced. The reporters described rooms where dozens of workers laboured in spaces meant for far fewer, where the air was thick with dust and lint, where tuberculosis spread rapidly in the cramped quarters, where children as young as 6 or 7 helped with the finishing work, sewing on buttons or pulling out basting threads. The articles caused a sensation, leading to public outcry and calls for reform. Some improvements were made, but the fundamental economic pressures that created these conditions remained. The 1890s brought a slight softening of Victorian fashion's excesses. The bustle disappeared. Sleeves began to balloon at the shoulders before becoming more fitted again. Skirts became slightly simpler, though still elaborate by modern standards. This was the era of the Gibson girl, that ideal American woman whose style influenced British fashion as well, with her upswept hair, her shirtwaist and skirt, her image of athletic femininity that suggested the new century approaching. When Victoria died in 1901, she left behind not just an empire, but an entire system of belief about how society should be ordered, how people should dress and behave, what was proper and what was not. The Edwardian era that followed would begin to dismantle some of these strictures, but the fashion industry Victoria's age had created would persist in many of its forms well into the 20th century. Throughout all of this, from Elizabeth I's jewelled magnificence to Victoria's black mourning weeds, the women who made the clothes remained largely invisible. Their names were not recorded, their stories not told, their contributions to British history acknowledged only in passing, if at all. Yet they were there, in every seam and stitch, in every carefully executed buttonhole, in every hour of painstaking embroidery. They sacrificed their eyesight and their health, their youth, and often their lives, to create the gorgeous garments that defined their eras. Mary Sullivan, the seamstress we met at the beginning of this story, is a fictional composite, but her experience represents that of thousands of real women. If she was lucky, she might have survived to her 30s, married a working man, perhaps continued to sew at home to supplement the family income. If she was less lucky, she might have died young from tuberculosis or typhus, from exhaustion or malnutrition, or from an infection in her needle-pricked fingers that spread to become blood poisoning. Her grave, if she had one, would have been unmarked, her death recorded only in the barest terms in a parish register. The dresses she made, if they survived at all, might now be in museums, displayed on mannequins in climate-controlled galleries, admired for their beauty and craftsmanship. Visitors might spend a few moments reading the label, noting the date and style, perhaps remarking on the tiny waist or the elaborate trimmings. Few would think about the hands that made those tiny, perfect stitches, the eyes that strained to see by inadequate light, the body that bent over the work, hour after hour, day after day. This is what fashion cost in the Victorian age. It cost beauty measured in human suffering, elegance purchased with poverty wages, magnificence built on the bodies of those who would never wear it. The system that created the gorgeous gowns we admire in museums and heritage houses was the same system that ground up working women in its machinery, that treated human beings as disposable resources, that valued the appearance of wealth more than the welfare of workers. Understanding this history doesn't mean we shouldn't appreciate the artistry and skill that went into creating these garments. The needlework was often extraordinary, the design innovative, the overall effect genuinely beautiful. But we should see them with clear eyes, recognizing that beauty and suffering were woven together in every thread, that the silk and the blood were part of the same story. The Victorian wardrobe was not just clothing. It was a social system, an economic structure, a set of beliefs about gender and class and what people owed to each other made tangible in fabric and thread. When we look at photographs of Victorian ladies in their magnificent gowns, when we watch period dramas that lovingly recreate the fashions of the era, We are seeing the visible part of a vast hidden structure. Behind every lady in silk was an army of invisible workers. Behind every gentleman in his perfectly tailored coat were cutters and sewers and pressers whose names we will never know. The fashion we see in the archives is only the tip of the iceberg, the beautiful surface that floated while the bulk of human cost remained submerged, out of sight and out of mind. The legacies of this era persist in ways both obvious and subtle. The fashion industry today still relies heavily on underpaid workers, still operates through complex supply chains that obscure the conditions under which garments are made, still produces clothes at a pace and price point that require someone, somewhere, to absorb the real costs. The specific circumstances have changed, but many of the underlying dynamics remain. Fast fashion is in many ways Victorian fashion's descendant, prioritizing volume and cheapness over quality and fair wages, treating workers as expendable, valuing the consumption of clothes over the lives of those who make them. Yet there are differences too. We have labour laws now, however imperfectly enforced. We have unions, worker protections, minimum wages. We have a growing awareness of fashion's human cost, movements for ethical fashion and sustainable production, consumers who are beginning to ask where their clothes come from and who made them. The Victorian seamstress who sewed for 16 hours a day in a freezing garret had no such protections, no recourse, no voice in the system that exploited her. We do, and what we choose to do with that power matters. The story of the Victorian wardrobe is ultimately a story about choices, about what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice to get it. It's a story about beauty and cruelty, existing side by side, about how societies can create extraordinary art while ignoring extraordinary suffering. It's a story that challenges us to look beyond the surface of things, to ask not just what something looks like, but what it costs and who pays that cost. As we close this journey through 3 centuries of fashion, from Elizabeth's glittering court to Victoria's black crepe, I hope you'll carry with you not just images of beautiful clothes, but an awareness of the human hands that made them, the human costs that purchased them, and the human stories that they simultaneously tell and conceal. History is not just about great events and famous names. It's about the unnamed many whose labour and lives made those events possible, whose contributions deserve to be remembered even when their names are lost. The next time you see a historical garment in a museum or on screen, take a moment to think about the woman who made it, about her tired fingers and strained eyes, about her hopes and dreams and disappointments. Think about what that beautiful thing cost in human terms, and ask yourself what lessons that history might teach us about the clothes we wear today and the world we want to create tomorrow. That seamstress working through the night in Victorian London, whoever she was, deserves to be remembered not as a nameless victim, but as a skilled craftswoman, a human being who contributed something of value to the world, even as the world gave her so little in return. Her story, and the stories of countless others like her, are woven into every thread of fashion history, and they deserve to be told.